While Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire had the Battle Tower for post-game enjoyment, Emerald had not only an enhanced Battle Tower, but also added 6 other facilities for the player to participate in, thus giving birth to the Battle Frontier. One of those 6 other facilities is the Battle Dome, not to be confused with the Battle Dome or the Battle Dome. This facility has a lot of mechanical depth under the hood, more than I bet most people realize. But before we get into that, a quick refresher on the basics of the Battle Dome. The Battle Dome is home to single elimination tournaments starring you and 15 other trainers, meaning the player needs to win 4 battles in order to get BP. In addition, while you pick 3 Pokemon to bring when registering in the lobby, each of the battles in the Battle Dome has you and your opponent picking just 2 of the Pokemon they have to actually bring into battle. This, along with only needing to partake in 4 battles, makes the Battle Dome quicker than your typical facility, like the Battle Tower. You may be thinking, well hold on, how am I supposed to know which 2 Pokemon to bring into a fight? Before each battle, you're given the option of viewing intel on not only your opponent, but any trainer taking part in the tournament. There's 4 pieces of information about every trainer: their Pokemon, their potential, their strategy, and how they've trained their Pokemon. You see the 3 Pokemon the trainer can choose from, but you don't know which 2 they'll pick. There is a formula the game uses to determine what Pokemon the computer will pick, but we'll cover that in just a minute. After making your preparations and choosing the 2 Pokemon you want to use, the battle begins, and the winner moves on. After a battle, you're also shown the results of all the CPU matches that took place, along with the updated tournament bracket. Before working on this video, I never really thought much about how the game determines all of these things. A trainer's potential, the simulation of CPU matches, even how the game selects which Pokemon your opponent will use. It turns out there's a lot of stuff under the hood that determines these things. Stuff that's surprisingly in-depth and detailed. It was really neat learning this stuff, and I hope to present it in an easy-to-understand form so everyone else can understand what's going on. Starting with the pieces of intel you get on a trainer, let's work from top to bottom. First is the trainer's Pokemon. This is fairly self-explanatory. There are 3 Pokemon the trainer has. Of course, both you and your opponent only bring 2 of your 3 Pokemon into battle. You can probably figure out 2 decent enough Pokemon to bring to take care of all 3 of the CPU's Pokemon, but how does the CPU determine which Pokemon they bring? Each of the opponent's 3 Pokemon gets assigned a score, and the 2 Pokemon with the highest score get selected, with any ties being broken randomly. This may sound simple enough, but how is the score determined? That's where things get a little complicated. First things first, there are actually 2 methods the game can use to calculate a Pokemon's score. Bulbapedia refers to these as the offensive method and the defensive method. Both of these methods compare the damage-dealing moves of the opponent's Pokemon to the types of your Pokemon, and award points based on the matchup, with the 2 methods being scored differently. The offensive method awards more points if the opponent's moves are super effective against your Pokemon, while the defensive method awards more points if your Pokemon resist the opponent's moves. Here's the part that confuses me though. The 2 highest scoring Pokemon are the Pokemon that the CPU will bring into battle, regardless of which method is used. This means that, if the defensive method is used, the CPU will bring in Pokemon that can barely damage you. I guess that could mean the Pokemon has a more supportive moveset, but theoretically, it could also mean that the Pokemon has a bunch of not very effective moves, and no status moves like Toxic. I'm not quite sure how else they do a defensive method though, so I guess this works? Sure, you could just run the calculation using the player's moves against the CPU's Pokemon, but then that would imply the CPU trainer knows all of our moves before the battle starts, when they shouldn't have that intel. Moving on, next we have the trainer's potential. This is just dependent on the trainer's seeding, because yes, just like your favorite sports ball tournament, each trainer has a seed assigned to them. It's not something that's randomly assigned, however. There is actually a formula behind it all. The game takes the number of different types amongst the Pokemon that the trainer has, multiplies that by the highest level their Pokemon have, then divides the result of that by 20. Don't ask me, man, I have no idea. The game then takes this number and adds it to the combined base stat totals of that trainer's Pokemon. The higher the sum of these numbers are, the higher a seed a trainer will have. There's even a tiebreaker programmed in, which, I suppose that's a good thing. Actually, the player automatically wins any tiebreakers, and the Frontier Brain Dome Ace Tucker wins any tiebreakers against other CPU trainers. The next line of intel is based on the moves that the trainer's Pokemon know. According to Bulbapedia, every move in the game has a series of flags. Oh no, it's the Mewtutor again. Yes, in the game's code is a list of moves with flags applied to them, with these flags determining what that second line of intel says. There are a small handful of moves with no flags, but the vast majority of moves have at least one flag assigned to them. The game tallies up how many flags of each kind are active on each of the moves on the trainer's Pokemon, and then looks through a list of the battle styles to try and find a style that meets the criteria. This list gets searched in order from top to bottom, so the style highest up on this list whose requirements are met is the one that gets chosen. Because of this, and the placement of some of the battle styles, there are a couple of them that are actually impossible to get. The Enfeeble High and Defense over Attack styles will never be selected, due to the requirements for the Enfeeble Low and Defense styles always being met first, along with those two styles being higher up on the list. The last bit of intel shares how the trainer raised their Pokemon. This text is determined by the EVs that the trainer's Pokemon have, as you might have guessed. However, that's not the whole story. You might think that'd be it, but no, the game also takes into account the natures of the trainer's Pokemon. It's handled in a bit of a weird way, too. Let's say a Pokemon has a modest nature, meaning its special attack gets boosted by 10% at the cost of its attack stat being lowered by 10%. Well, what the game does is, when it's calculating how many EVs that Pokemon has in their stats, it'll alter the number of EVs in the relevant stats of that nature by 10%. In the case of a modest nature, that means the Pokemon is treated as having 10% more special attack EVs and 10% less attack EVs. Of course, these changes are only for determining this bit of intel. You won't actually be fighting a Pokemon with more than 255 EVs in a stat. I find this method kind of weird just because natures don't affect EVs. They affect the respective stats as a whole. Having said that, however, I can't think of any other way they'd implement natures into this, and natures are an important part of a Pokemon's stats, so I guess this works. If I had a nickel for every time I said that about some obscure mechanic in the Battle Dome, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. There's one other thing the game puts a lot of effort into figuring out, and that's how CPU battles are simulated. Except, according to Bulbapedia's description of this, simulated is the wrong word to use. Instead, trainers are assigned a score based on the efficacy of their Pokemon's attacks, compared to the types of the opponent's Pokemon, their Pokemon's base stats divided by 10, their seed minus 1, and then a random number from 0 to 31. Whoever has the highest number wins and moves on. The fact that these battles aren't actually simulated is actually pretty interesting, because when you look at the tournament tree and look at a particular trainer, you can press right on the D-pad to see how their last battle ended, and the move used to win the fight. This also includes the results of battles against 2 NPCs. Wait a minute, didn't I just say those battles aren't simulated? Meaning they don't actually happen? How does a winning move exist, then? Unfortunately, I'm not super fluent in reading code, so I asked this question on the Pret Discord server, and this user very kindly explained how the game determines the winning move. Remember how each trainer's moves get assigned a score based on their efficacy? Apparently the game just chooses the move that got the most points during that part of the calculation. And taking a look at that part of the code, apparently a part of it is bugged. Thanks, Game Freak! I jokingly mentioned the Mewtutor before, but between that and how the Battle Dome is handled, it's become apparent to me that the Generation 3 games have multiple mechanics that are surprisingly complex, and I think that's pretty cool. Compare this to something like the Academy Ace tournament in Scarlet and Violet. Conceptually, it's fairly similar to the Battle Dome. It's a single elimination tournament involving 16 trainers, defeat 4 trainers, and win a prize. That's where the similarities end, though. There aren't any special rules for the battles. Everyone just uses their full team, CPU battles aren't simulated, and there's no tournament bracket to view, so your next opponent is just randomly chosen. I'm not trying to say it's a bad thing that the Academy Ace tournament is simplified. You could probably make the argument that it's a good thing that it's simplified. Regardless, I think it's worth it to take a moment and look at these kinds of things, analyze the priorities of game development, or what we can extrapolate from things like game features and how certain things work. This could probably lead into a whole video essay about modern game development compared to game development 20 years ago, but that'd have to be a different video, cause we're getting a bit off track here. Going back to the Battle Dome, like any Battle Frontier facility, if you proceed far enough, the Frontier Brain will come out and challenge you to a battle. Upon starting the 5th tournament in your streak, one of the trainers in the bracket will be Dome Ace Tucker. Tucker always wins his battles against other CPU trainers, meaning he'll always make it to the finals. Meet him there and you'll have to defeat his team of Swampert, Salamence, and Charizard. Well, 2 of them at least. Tucker's Pokemon are all pretty strong, but they each have a 4x weakness, which is something that applies to no other Frontier Brain. Well, okay, it can apply to one other brain, but we'll talk about him when we get to his facility. Despite the number of 4x weaknesses, Tucker's Pokemon are still pretty tough, as they have all their IVs set to 20. This is a bit of a jump from the normal trainers, whose IVs are all... Game Freak, I swear to God. Okay, so it turns out that the IVs of trainers don't increase as you go through the Battle Dome. What else is there to this facility? Because of this bug, literally every single trainer other than Tucker will always have 3 IVs on all of their Pokemon stats. I guess this means if you're capable of handling Tucker, this makes the Dome one of the easier facilities, just due to the weaker opponents. And actually, there's one other thing that makes the Dome easier than other facilities. Well, easier in quotes, since you have to actually consistently pull this off. If your battle ends in a tie, say from taking out the opponent's last Pokemon with your last Pokemon using Self-Destruct or Explosion, not only does the game actually account for this and display entirely different dialogue, but the trainer who's seeded higher will automatically be considered the winner. Just, be careful for moves like Protect and Endure. Might want to make sure Taunt is in your moveset. Bright Powder causing you to miss also sucks. Interestingly, because the game states that a referee is determining the winner, the battle ends without the opponent giving any victory or defeat dialogue. The game just cuts back to the Dome after both Pokemon faint. I can't think of another time something like this happens in the Battle Frontier. But going back to Tucker, I noticed Bulbapedia says that he's always the number 2 seed. This places him in the perfect position to take you on at the end of the tournament, right? Well, sure, if you're the number 1 seed, or otherwise on the left side of the tournament bracket. Cause you're not automatically given the number 1 seed just because you're the player character. You can have a lower seed. Here's footage of me being the number 16 seed, although I'm still on the left side of the bracket. So, what would happen if you ended up on the right side of the bracket, the side where Tucker normally is? In that case, Tucker will automatically take the number 1 seed, putting him on the left side of the bracket. Probably pretty easy to assume, but with Game Freak and Pokemon, you never know what might happen. Anyway, if you beat Tucker here, you get the silver ability symbol. If you make it to the end of the 10th tournament in a row, Tucker reappears with his gold team. He keeps his Swampert from the silver battle, but this time he adds a Metagross and a Latias. In addition, all of his Pokemon have perfect IVs in all of their stats. He's not messing around this time. Defeating him gets you the gold ability symbol. and from there on out, Tucker will reappear at the end of every 5th tournament with his gold team until you lose your streak. Anytime you defeat Tucker, you get an additional 10 BP on top of whatever BP you'd normally get. Speaking of which, because the Battle Dome only has 4 battles in order for you to get BP, you only get an increase to the amount of BP you get every other round. This is in contrast to the Battle Tower, the previous facility I covered, where you got an additional BP for every round you cleared. And I think that's about all there is to say in regards to the Battle Dome. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the video and maybe even learned something neat. A big thank you to Darkmaster Zork, Mithril Monarch, PK Smokey, Sedzi, and Duna Nix, along with the rest of my patrons scrolling by for going the extra mile and financially supporting the channel. See you next time, everyone.